Abigail Carter wasn't one to flaunt her success. At 34, she was a senior software engineer at Atlas Innovations, and her current life was the product of relentless discipline, quiet endurance, and self-made effort. Her $660,000 condo in Rivergate Heights wasn't a gift from anyone. It was the result of years spent skipping vacations, working through holidays, and funneling every spare dollar into her savings. Every detail of her home, from the marble countertops in the kitchen to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, reflected a woman who had fought tooth and nail for the right to own her life. But from the outside, no one would know. To strangers, Abigail was simply a successful woman living alone in a luxury apartment. To her co-workers, she was the quiet one who always delivered. To her family, she was the one who doesn't share someone whose life was easy because she was born smart. Abigail had always been the outsider in her own family. Her parents, Douglas and Margaret Carter, favored their eldest son, Brandon. He was the golden child, charming, athletic, endlessly indulged. Abigail, on the other hand, was the quiet bookworm, the one who quickly learned that fairness wasn't a value practiced in their household. By 16, she was working part-time at a bookstore while Brandon received a brand new car for his birthday. When Abigail asked about her college fund, her mother simply replied, "You're smart, honey. You'll get scholarships." Abigail didn't argue. She had long since learned to rely on herself, and she did. She graduated from Northbridge University on a full scholarship in computer science, then spent years at a startup living frugally. 6 years later, she joined Atlas Innovations in a senior position, finally earning what her skills deserved. The day Abigail signed the papers for her Rivergate Heights condo, she cried. No one from her family was there. She had invited them to a small housewarming, but no one came. Brandon had a networking event, and her parents claimed they were too tired. Abigail wasn't surprised. She quietly unpacked her books and took a deep breath on the balcony of her 14th floor unit, a space where for the first time she truly felt she belonged. In a world where women's success is often labeled as luck or a result of not having a family, Abigail knew what she had to prove, not to others, but to herself. The condo wasn't just a place to live, it was proof of one truth. She no longer lived in anyone's shadow. From a very young age, Abigail Carter understood that not all children were treated equally in her family. Her older brother Brandon was always the favored one. With his tousled blonde hair, charming smile, and the ability to befriend anyone in 5 minutes, Brandon was the embodiment of the perfect son in the eyes of their parents, Douglas and Margaret. Abigail. She was the afterthought, the studious, quiet daughter who was consistently sidelined. Douglas loved to boast about Brandon's athletic talent, despite the fact that he never won any meaningful awards. Margaret rushed around, supporting every promising project her son dreamed up, from school basketball tournaments to strange business ideas he'd abandon a month later. To them, Abigail was just the self-sufficient one. At 16, Abigail worked weekends at the local bookstore to save for a used laptop for school. Meanwhile, Brandon, having just wrecked his second car, was gifted a newer, flashier vehicle. He's still growing. Douglas chuckled as though crashing cars was part of adolescence. Abigail wasn't angry. She was used to it. She was used to being overlooked at family dinners, dismissed in conversations, and having her efforts treated as expected. But being used to something didn't mean it didn't hurt. Throughout high school, Brandon had an open line to his parents' wallets, while Abigail fought for scholarship essays every semester. When she asked about her college plans, Margaret casually said, "Brandon will go to state, we've saved for that." "But you're smart, honey. You'll get scholarships." Even when Abigail earned a full ride to Northbridge University, the news was eclipsed by Brandon being named co-captain of a local junior basketball league. Her parents called it a huge family achievement. Brandon wasn't just favored, he was excused. When his first cafe failed after 3 months, Douglas blamed the economy. When his sports app never made it past mock-up, Margaret shrugged and said, "Creative minds are often misunderstood." Abigail, on the other hand, was never allowed to fail. The injustice wasn't just in the actions, it was in the unspoken message sent to Abigail every single day: "You will never matter as much as your brother." Not ever. Still, Abigail never stopped trying. She attended every birthday party for her niece and nephew Jackson, and Ella always bringing thoughtful gifts. She called, sent cards, checked in. In return, she got comments like, "You have time," or "Are you too busy?" Making money from Brandon, and "We don't want the kids influenced by your selfish lifestyle," from her mother when she declined to invest in another one of their schemes. Over time, Abigail stopped expecting validation, but the pain never left. It simply morphed into silence, into the way she'd end calls with a fake laugh, or how she'd pause outside her condo door wondering, "Why am I still trying to maintain a relationship that only ever moves one way?" Abigail Carter received the invitation to her brother's 40th birthday party on a quiet Tuesday morning, the subject line glowing with enthusiasm. "Join us to celebrate Brandon's big milestone." She skimmed the details: a Saturday evening party at her parents' home in Glen Ridge, less than 3 weeks away. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She had long associated family gatherings with forced smiles and thinly veiled criticism. But then the messages began. First came one from her mother, Margaret, laced with her signature emotional guilt. "You have to come, sweetheart. This is a special occasion. The whole family will be there." The next day, her father Douglas called her directly, his voice unusually solemn. "Brandon would be crushed if you didn't come. There's something important we're planning to discuss with you." Even Brandon, who rarely texted unless he needed tech help, sent a friendly message. "Really hope you can make it Saturday. There's something we all want to talk to you about." A strange sense of dread crept in. The words were soft, but the undertone was firm. Her presence wasn't optional. When Abigail met her best friend Lauren for coffee that Thursday, she shared the strange pressure she'd been feeling. "They're laying it on thick this time," Lauren said, stirring her latte. "It sounds like they're gearing up for something big." Abigail exhaled slowly. "Probably another one of Brandon's business pitches. Mom's been saying a lot about sharing family wealth and how property is just material." Lauren frowned. "Remember Thanksgiving last year? When your mom said if you really loved your family, you'd think about how your assets could serve the greater good." Abigail nodded. She'd brushed off those comments, then chalking them up to her mother's usual guilt tactics. But now, pieced together, they formed something more ominous, something deliberate. A setup, and Brandon's birthday party just the stage. Still uncertain, Abigail decided to go. She carefully chose a navy blue dress professional, but understated the kind that wouldn't invite accusations of showing off. She bought Brandon an expensive watch, not because he deserved it, but because any less would trigger familiar jabs about her being stingy despite the big tech salary. That Friday night, she couldn't sleep. Her mind spun with possible scenarios, a heartfelt speech to guilt her, maybe even a surprise family meeting. Her gut told her this party wasn't about celebration, and she was right. The truth was, those messages hadn't simply been invitations, they were the opening act of something far more calculated. A plan Abigail hadn't been informed of, but one in which she would be center stage. That Saturday afternoon, the weather in Glen Ridge was unseasonably warm, sunlight spilling through the trees along the quiet suburban streets. Abigail Carter drove toward her parents' house with a tightness in her chest. She parked a block away, an old habit, putting physical distance between herself and a place that had never felt like true refuge. As she stepped through the familiar side gate into the backyard, the sound of music and laughter surrounded her. Brandon's birthday party wasn't a cozy family gathering. It was a full-blown spectacle. Over 100 guests mingled beneath string lights. A bartender served custom cocktails, and servers in black aprons passed around gourmet hors d'oeuvres. A gift table overflowed with presents under the patio canopy. "Abigail, you made it!" Margaret exclaimed, pulling her into an overly enthusiastic, performative hug. Douglas appeared with a drink in hand, calling out, "Look who finally found time in her busy executive schedule." The words were cheerful, but the tone was unmistakably barbed. Abigail offered a polite smile, her grip tightening around the sleek, silver-wrapped gift box, a luxury watch for Brandon. She placed it on the overflowing gift table, keeping her expression calm, even as her stomach twisted. She wasn't unfamiliar with passive-aggressive remarks. Every family gathering was a balancing act: stay composed, say, little absorb the digs. But something about today felt heavier, like a script was being followed and she hadn't been given her lines. Her Aunt Eleanor swooped in with a knowing smirk. "Still single, dear. My friend's son just moved to Chicago. He's a lawyer." Another guest chimed in. "I hear your condo's worth a fortune now. Doesn't it feel like a waste for just one person?" Abigail smiled tightly. She was used to her life being reduced to property value and marital status. Then came the grand entrance. Brandon, dressed in a tailored suit, hair slicked back, cologne far too strong, emerged with his wife and kids in tow like a picture-perfect family from a magazine. When he spotted Abigail, he spread his arms wide and pulled her into a showy embrace. "There she is, my little sister. The family success story, gracing us humble folks with her presence." Abigail froze, returning the hug stiffly before gently pulling away. Brandon wasn't done. "Maybe tonight some of that big tech luck will rub off on the rest of us. Success is meant to be shared, right?" His words were coated in humor, but Abigail recognized the undertone, each sentence a subtle challenge, softening the crowd for something bigger. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced conversations. Everyone was polite, but beneath the surface, the judgment lingered. Someone asked if she planned to settle down. Another brought up the property value trends in Rivergate Heights. Abigail began silently counting the minutes, how much longer before she could leave without offending anyone. Then her mother appeared at her side, touching her shoulder gently. "Abigail, dear, could you step into your father's study for a moment? We've been meaning to talk to you about something." In that instant, Abigail knew the real reason for the party. The true event was only just beginning. Abigail followed her mother down the dim hallway and into her father's study, a space of dark wood and old leather that had always felt off-limits as a child. The scent of tobacco lingered in the air, mixed with aged books and polished oak. Douglas and Brandon were already seated, their expressions carefully composed. But Abigail could sense the calculation behind their calm. "Would you close the door, sweetheart?" Douglas asked, his tone far more serious than the jovial one he'd used outside. Abigail complied, then took the only available seat, a hard, armless wooden chair near the bookshelf, facing the leather sofa where Brandon lounged comfortably. The arrangement spoke volumes: who was welcomed and who was simply tolerated. Douglas clasped his hands on the desk, assuming his familiar negotiation mode. "We wanted to have a serious conversation with you as a family." Brandon leaned forward, wearing a concerned expression that felt entirely rehearsed. "You know things have been tough lately," he said, waiting for her to nod. Douglas picked it up. "The business environment is unstable. My company's struggling, and Brandon's fitness app development has run into major expenses." Margaret sat beside Brandon, adding in her softest voice, "So we've come up with a solution, one that benefits everyone." Abigail said nothing. She knew what was coming wouldn't benefit her. Douglas exhaled slowly. "Your condo in Rivergate Heights. You live there alone, right?" Her chest tightened. Brandon continued smoothly, as if they'd rehearsed. "Rachel and I have been looking into schools in that district. They're way better than what the kids have now. Douglas added, being closer to the city would help with my work too, and we'd all be near each other, more connected. Margaret reached for Abigail's hand, but Abigail gently pulled away. What we're proposing, Margaret said, her voice syrupy sweet, is that you sign over the condo to Brandon and his family. They need the space, and you can easily afford something more suitable for a single woman. A heavy silence fell over the room. Abigail looked from one face to the next. They weren't asking. They were presenting the plan as if her compliance was assumed. Her voice was low, steady. You're saying, I should give up the home I spent nearly a decade saving for the one I worked nights and weekends to earn. Brandon shrugged. You can buy another one. We're family. Douglas nodded. We've been discussing this for months. It's the logical move. Abigail stood, her tone suddenly icy. No, absolutely not. She stared them down. That condo is mine. I earned it. And I'm not giving it to anyone, even family. Brandon's face twisted. You're always so selfish. Some things never change. Douglas slammed his palm on the desk. Family means sacrifice. What do you even have besides a job and an apartment? Abigail's hands clenched. I have self-respect. And I've sacrificed enough paying for Brandon's car repairs, gifts for your grandkids' loans to you both that never got repaid. But my home, that's my line. Margaret's voice turned sharp. After all we've done for you. Abigail laughed, short, bitter. Really? And what exactly is all that? I put myself through school while you funneled every dime into Brandon. Let's not rewrite history. She turned toward the door, her hand on the knob. This meeting is over. Abigail stepped out of the study, her heart pounding with the kind of fury that shakes your core. The conversation had been quiet but brutal, and all she wanted now was to grab her purse and leave that house forever if possible. The party was still going on in the backyard, but as she and Brandon reappeared, a ripple of tension spread through the crowd. The music continued, but guests turned toward them, drawn by Brandon's voice, which had taken on a louder, sharper edge. Of course, 34 years old and still only thinking about yourself. Abigail walked briskly toward the side table where she had left her purse, determined not to engage. Every step was a struggle to maintain composure. Her mother intercepted, her voice pleading. Please, Abigail, just think about it. We can discuss the details later. She shook her off. There's nothing to discuss. Her father stood now, face red, with a cocktail of anger and embarrassment. After everything this family has done for you, this is how you repay us. Abigail turned, her voice icy. Family doesn't give you the right to demand sacrifices I never agreed to. That's when Brandon snapped. You think you're better than us, don't you? With your fancy job and your expensive condo. She didn't answer. The silence only enraged him further. He stormed toward her arms, gesturing wildly, and in a flash grabbed a champagne bottle from an ice bucket nearby. Rachel rushed over, grabbing at his arm. Brandon, stop. Not here. Not now. But he wasn't listening. As Abigail reached for the front door handle, she barely heard the gasp behind her before it happened. The bottle smashed into the back of her head with a sickening crack. Glass shattered. She stumbled forward, clutching the door frame, then collapsed to her knees as warmth gushed down her back. Blood mixed with champagne soaking her dress. Screams broke out all around. Party guests froze. Others lunged into action. Someone called 911. Someone else knelt beside her, Nina, the neighbor and ER nurse. Her hands moved swiftly, pressing against the wound. Stay with me, Abigail. The ambulance is on its way. Don't close your eyes. Dizzy Abigail tried to focus. Through blurred vision, she saw Brandon in the doorway, the jagged neck of the broken bottle still in his hand. His face was twisted into something she couldn't quite define, part shock, part satisfaction. Everything blurred. The sound of sirens, flashing lights, a voice asking her name, another asking what day it was. Through it all, Abigail managed to whisper one thing before slipping into unconsciousness. "My brother hit me with a bottle." Abigail woke to the sterile glow of the ER lights at St. Andrew's Medical Center, her head-bandaged hair crusted with blood, and every nerve in her body aching. Beside her sat Nina, the kind-hearted neighbor and ER nurse who had stayed by her side from the moment the bottle shattered to the ride in the ambulance. The police had already arrived. They spoke with her gently but firmly. "Ms. Carter, we've taken Brandon into custody. Dozens of guests witnessed the attack." Abigail nodded, her eyes dry and steady. "I want to press charges," she said clearly. "Assault and anything else applicable." Lauren arrived not long after, her face pale with worry, but her voice burning with anger. "They crossed a line this time," she said through clenched teeth. Family or not, this was a crime. The next morning, Abigail was discharged with instructions to monitor for concussion symptoms and a stitched-up scalp, 15 stitches in total. Lauren drove her home to her condo, which now felt different. Not just a sanctuary, but a place that had been quietly targeted by her own family, a possession they felt entitled to. That afternoon, Jessica Morano, Lauren's cousin and a seasoned family law attorney, met with Abigail in her living room. After hearing the full story, Jessica was silent for a moment. "The assault is just the beginning," she finally said. "This sounds like a long-running scheme. We could be looking at fraud, coercion, possibly forged documents." Abigail recalled signing a few papers years ago, something about refinancing her parents' home. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "We need to investigate the deed. I suspect your name's on it and you didn't even know." 2 days later, Jessica returned with a thick folder. "You're on the title for the Glenridge house," she said. Abigail stared in shock. "I don't remember agreeing to that. You signed under misleading pretenses. That can qualify as fraudulent misrepresentation." And that wasn't all. A deeper dive revealed that Brandon had registered a business using Abigail's condo address without her consent. He had also taken out credit lines, submitted school applications for his children, and received mail at her home. "They've been planning this for a while," Jessica said grimly. The birthday party wasn't the start, it was the end game. A push to make the takeover feel legitimate through family pressure. What began as an act of violence had now unraveled into a systematic, premeditated scheme, months, maybe even years in the making. Abigail felt a cold shiver, not from the trauma of the blow, but from the realization of just how much she had been blind to. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty for standing her ground. Abigail sat at Lauren's kitchen table, now transformed into a makeshift command center surrounded by stacks of legal files, bank statements, and signed affidavits. She was no longer the woman struck down by a champagne bottle. She was someone taking her power back piece by piece. Attorney Jessica Morano and forensic accountant Ethan Delgado moved with precision, laying out evidence of forged documents, identity misuse, and an orchestrated attempt to seize Abigail's property. Each document was another layer of betrayal peeled away. They executed this in steps, Ethan explained. Starting with the forged refinance documents, then registering Mitchell Labs at your condo address, and now the unauthorized use of your name and property, this all adds up to a coordinated case of asset fraud. Abigail listened not with fear, but with a sharpened sense of focus. She no longer hoped for apologies from her parents or remorse from Brandon. She wanted facts. She wanted justice. "I want this handled completely," Abigail said, her voice steady. "Not just the assault charges. I want every one of their actions held accountable." Jessica nodded. "The next step is filing for a restraining order. After that, we'll submit a partition action against the Glenridge house. As a co-owner, you have the legal right to force a sale." Abigail paused. For a second, the idea of selling the house her parents had lived in for 3 decades made her hesitate. But then she remembered Brandon's eyes, the shattered bottle, and that cold, satisfied look. No, this wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. "Do it," she said. "They chose this path. I'm just following the law." In the days that followed, things moved fast. Legal filings were submitted, evidence handed over to investigators, and Abigail's restraining order against Brandon was granted during the first court hearing. By the third week, she received a call from the county office. "Your petition to force the sale of the Glenridge property has been approved. The process will begin within 30 days. She set her phone down and looked out the window of her condo, sunlight falling gently on the small herb garden she'd nurtured since moving in. Something had ended, but something else had begun. She was no longer clinging to a family that refused to see her. Now she was rewriting the rules of engagement. On Saturday morning, Abigail Carter stood in front of 1721 Maple Hill Lane, the house her parents had lived in for nearly 3 decades. It had once held family dinners and childhood memories, but it had also housed favoritism, silence, and ultimately betrayal. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood attorney Jessica Morano, Officer Martinez from the county sheriff's department, and a moving truck parked discreetly across the street. In Abigail's hand was a court order, simple in appearance, but heavy with the weight of justice and personal reclamation. "Are you sure about this?" Jessica asked. Abigail nodded. "They need to see this. Not to humiliate them, but to understand that actions have consequences." Officer Martinez knocked on the door. Moments later, Douglas Carter, her father, appeared in a faded polo shirt and khakis. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he registered Abigail, the lawyer, and the uniformed officer. "What is this?" he asked, eyes locked on the papers. "We're here to enforce a court-ordered property sale," Martinez stated. "This house has been sold. You have 48 hours to vacate." "That's impossible. This is our home." "No," Abigail said quietly. "It's jointly owned property, and I chose to sell my share." Margaret Carter rushed to the door, still in her bathrobe. The moment she saw Abigail, her eyes welled with tears. "Abigail, what are you doing? This is your family, and this family forged my signature, tried to steal my home, and let their son assault me." Brandon stormed in, face flushed and furious. "You really are heartless. Does family mean nothing to you anymore?" Abigail looked at him, the brother who once assumed she'd stay quiet, and replied evenly, "Family isn't a license to control or harm. It's built on respect. And there's none left here." Neighbors watched from porches. A few old family friends stood on the sidewalk. Some had seen the incident at the party. Others were only now realizing the depth of what had unfolded. Abigail handed over the documents. The silence was palpable as her family faced the truth. No more gray areas, no more pretending. But she wasn't finished. Turning to her mother, she said, "I've arranged a 2-bedroom apartment for you and Dad. Rent's paid through the end of the year. Not out of obligation, but because I still choose decency." Then to Brandon, "And even though you don't deserve it, your kids do. I've set up college funds for both of them." This wasn't revenge. It was closure, a full stop at the end of a long, painful chapter. And as Abigail turned away, walking calmly without a backward glance, she did so not in anger, but in certainty, the kind that only comes from becoming who you were always meant to be. 3 months after the court-ordered eviction, Abigail sat at her favorite harborside cafe, a quiet cup of coffee in hand. An unopened book rested on her lap, but her gaze was fixed on the open water, calm, wide, and unbound. Her life had changed not loudly, but profoundly. Her condo was finally what it was always meant to be, a sanctuary. No more strange mail, no more paperwork bearing other people's names. She had changed the locks, changed her phone number, and for the first time in years didn't flinch when the doorbell rang. Abigail was no longer the woman who bent to please everyone. She had learned to say no without apology, to listen to herself before others. What was once labeled selfish had become healthy boundaries. Jessica, now more than just a lawyer, a true friend, had once said, "Family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by people who choose to respect each other daily." And Abigail began choosing her own family. Lauren, who had stood by her through the storm, was the first member of this chosen family. Nina, the nurse next door turned Sunday brunch friend, was next. Then came the new colleagues at the startup she invested in, professionals who saw her value without trying to possess it. One afternoon at a Women Reclaiming Power event, Abigail stood before hundreds of women who had faced their own histories of control, silence, and pain. She shared her story not as a victim, but as a survivor. A woman rebuilt from brokenness. "I used to think I had to endure to be called a daughter, a sister, part of a family, but I learned I don't have to sacrifice myself to maintain a relationship that harms me." The applause wasn't pity, it was recognition. What Abigail felt wasn't triumph, it was peace. A kind of peace that doesn't come from revenge, but from understanding. That night back in her condo, Abigail looked at herself in the mirror. She no longer saw a woman exhausted from chasing approval. She saw someone who knew who she was, what was enough, and what no longer belonged in her life. Redefining family didn't mean cutting everyone off. It meant choosing who deserved to stay. Taking control of her life didn't come from power, it came from clarity. Abigail no longer needed anyone's permission to live her truth. Because in the end, true freedom isn't about being accepted by others, it's about choosing yourself.